Welcome to the State of Cybersecurity Industry panel series. We are proud to bring together decades of cybersecurity experience from world-class experts, executives, and strategic advisors. We will explore the present and future of cybersecurity evolution, talk about compliance and regulation, best practices, emerging threats, and the impact on the IoT and OT device market.
Hello, and welcome to the State of Cybersecurity podcast, panel webinar webcast. My name is Chris Blask. I'm the Vice President of Strategy with Cybeats. And I have with me on the panel today three fascinating panelists to talk about the impact of software bill of materials. You know, as we all go together down the path of producing software bill of materials for purposes and consuming them for purposes, and then using all of this network of visibility into inventory of software supply chain for purposes. The people we have on the panel today with Cassie, representing Schneider, a big producer and consumer themselves of software and therefore software bill of materials, with Phil with National Grid, as a consumer, a large regulated utility that brings software in and operates critical infrastructure, and Shirley Goodman joins us with the Linux Foundation Energy Project, a project looking to stitch all these constituent pieces together for a purpose. In this case, for decarbonization using open source and other platforms that Shuli can share with us. So thank all three of you very much for joining me today here. This is an amazing topic. Each of us have spent so much time on this over the last several years, and day to day, week to week, and month to month, it's moving. So I think if we have, as we talked about before the broadcast, we can take this in a number of directions. You know, far be it for me to tell any of you what the important things are to talk about. But I think if we go around a little bit on some thoughts on topics, like with Cassie, since you're like at the top of the screen and everything, right? Starting with you, as with your software producer hat on. What are the problems? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Are software bill of materials a burden always? Are they sometimes a benefit? Is it a mixed blessing, or do we know yet?
Well, I think it's a mixed blessing. I think there's still quite a number of unknowns, but there's been significant progress in regards to SBOM creation and the build process for such. There's a long way to go. There's discussions mainly on cloud realm. How do we manage legacy products? How do you go back and get SBOMs from products that are not currently in a development pipeline? But overall, it's very exciting to get that transparency, both from suppliers of our own, and then how do we deliver that transparency to our consumers and customers? Right.
And I tend to agree. And I think at this part I'm supposed to be introducing people. Cassie has been leading Schneider Electric's supply chain and software bill of materials activities for the last several years, and is at the forefront of that in the vendor space. And Phil Tonkin, who has for 5 or 6 days now been at National Grid running the cybersecurity operations. If you want to give a little bit of background on how you get into all this mess. But asking that sort of next order of question for you. So as a consumer, given who you are with National Grid and putting other hats on to imagine, similar organizations, what is the value? What do you actually do with an SBOM?
There's a huge amount of value in it, not just in understanding the assets that you have to manage the threats that might come from vulnerabilities or specific configurations that could be exploited. There's also a lot of commercial value in there, understanding the life cycle of the assets that you're looking at, understanding what what problems might emerge due to the supportability of certain components or the compatibility of certain components across your systems. So I think there's a huge amount of value across, across our estate and in the software bill of materials as a concept. It's obviously much more complex when you start to think about devices that are operating within an industrial environment, in particular where you've got assets that may be 20 years old even, and maybe long out of support, and the construct of those devices was wrapped up in this concept we call firmware, which is it's a single homogeneous piece of software, but actually in reality there's a lot of complexity going on within those devices, and getting a true understanding of what actually underpins them can help us understand the continued life cycle management of those devices, help us understand and how we prioritize the asset management, when we might replace them, how we might maintain them, what other mitigations we might need to put around them, both commercially and from a security perspective.
So Shuli Goodman is the executive director of the Linux Foundation Energy Project, a fascinating project at lfenergy.org. I recommend everybody take a look at this. If you could, your thoughts, because you and I have met through all of this, and there's attestation channels and software bill of materials, but we're trying to do things with them. And you have all the stakeholders, who are primarily the vendors and consumers. Do you see this, or how do you see this move, this mandate for SBOMs, this acceleration, helping us save the world by decarbonizing the energy systems, for example?
That's a great question. So I think in listening to Cassie and Philly, I'm probably looking at it a little bit kind of more looking forward, and which is about the software that is going to compose future power system networks. Up until now, proprietary and black box, and perhaps a lack of interoperability between vendors was the constraining force with regards to how how software was managed within utilities. So moving forward and looking at that, 80 to 90% of all software is probably open source. We have made a commitment within LF Energy to ensure that every single one of our projects has SBOMs, and that we scan on a quarterly basis in order to ensure that we have healthy SBOMs. Now, I think that security is a complex issue that interfaces between humans and code and supply chain. And so it really, I see that the issue that is before us is, can we all agree this is how we are going to build our software supply chains so that they are healthy and secure going forward? We have two projects at the foundation. One is called Compass and the other one is called CPATH. That both National Grid and Schneider Electric have been working on, that are about substation automation and virtualization and a configuration tool for 61850 for substations in order to enable interoperability. And at the heart of that are SBOMs that every single project has to comply with, and that we work with the teams to ensure so that going forward, when Schneider Electric takes that software, builds it on top of hardware, and then replicates it across hundreds of thousands or millions of substations, that they're using software that they understand and know the attestation and the provenance for. So I think it's a really positive indication that we're beginning to get our heads around what it means to digitalize energy, and what it's going to mean to ensure decarbonization, because we're moving from systems that were basically under lock and key to distributed energy that could be owned not only by the utility, but any kind of consumer, or that you could have a vehicle that is on the grid as a resource, or off the grid, or on the grid as a load. And that kind of transformation of the systems is going to mean that at every step of the way, we are sure we understand the software bill of materials, because we're creating a future at speed. So I want to thank both National Grid and Schneider Electric for being part of those projects and for encouraging us to really ensure that we have SBOMs.
Well, there's so much inside that, right? I'm really glad. I'm so glad to have you here today because it's all of us. I think Cassie and Phil and I, as guilty as the rest of us, we're all focused on these things we need to do right now. And I have a question, to ask in a little bit to move it forward, but you're already there. The combination of values of this. An interesting tangent on this in the digital bill of materials distortion activity, the National Manufacturing Institute of Scotland, Shuli. If I haven't connected you with them, I need to do that. But they're looking at a carbon application. These same systems apply to more than security. So let me go there with that one. This is probably a question out of order, Anthony. But in any particular order, from Phil or Cassie, are SBOMs more than security? I mean, are we just trying to solve how to take a vulnerability and match it to a piece of code, or is there something more going on? Are we setting up systems, not to seed the answer, but are these same systems worth, a lot in operations and saving effort in making better code, that's cheaper and faster to make, and meeting goals like Shuli's, or these unrelated activities?
You want to go first, Phil?
I think they are absolutely related. I think we have to make sure that we're not continuing to build on an existing challenge. We have obviously significant legacy estates and very complex existing assets which are supporting the energy networks, and those energy networks are evolving all of the time. And on that decarbonization journey, where in particular we need to use those existing assets in smarter ways in order to move energy around a lot more effectively. And the absolute key to that is the acquisition of data from those systems. And whether that's through new applications or applications which need to interface with legacy digital capabilities. We often talk about the digitization of the grid. The grid has been digitized for the last 20 years, thanks to the efforts of working groups like E03, which started moving data around in substations using IP networks back in the 90s. So we've been on IP networks for some time. We've had digital microprocessor-based devices for decades now, operating within sites. But it's the access and the use of that data which will drive forward this decarbonization journey, which requires the smarter use of the networks. So I think it's something we have to constantly think about. How do we complement those two journeys? How do we build tools much more successfully in the future to make sure we're not introducing new challenges whilst working in parallel on some of the older challenges? And in particular, where the two things meet, that's where we're going to find, and it's in that confluence that we find some of the greatest security challenges. And I think that's an area of real focus.
From a perspective of SBOMs, and are they only about security? I would say definitely not. I think that all of us who have been in the IT and OT space and just in general, we understood the necessary reasons for understanding what your assets were. It might have started very basic in the beginning, what computers, what laptops, what systems are out there. And now it is definitely expanded into OT space. Whereas we're talking just at like a device or a product level, then that additional visibility, whereas on a laptop, you can easily, understand what the assets are that you have, what's making it up. But it's more difficult in the complex environments that may not have all the connectivity and all of the tools necessary to do that, especially in OT space. And by providing those SBOMs, that gives that information about what, again, Shirley was saying about the black box, is that while the vendor or the manufacturer themselves had that information previously. So it was their responsibility to address those risks. We're definitely seeing, and we see this very much so in the OT space, is that in order to mitigate risks, you can't completely depend on that, especially in a firmware where you only have a certain space available for any type of security features, and so you need to understand what security features and defenses that you have, but also what are the risks, and giving that SBOM and that knowledge where you're aware of operating systems and such, gives that visibility that the asset owners and the consumers and have not had that availability for information without reverse engineering it on their own. So I think that providing this is a part of security, but that also should recognize that when they're doing that inspection of their systems, that they have an obligation to really understand, I'm putting myself at risk if I don't do patch management, at least at a certain periodic standpoint, or there might be end of life components and end of life systems in general, and how am I going to manage that risk from whether network segmentation, zero trust, any of the different models, and the SBOMs will give that perspective to the vendor, just as knowing itself if the product is an end of life. And so I do find that they're a part of security, but that also transfers sort of that knowledge and that responsibility into the hands of somebody who needs to take action right away in a quick manner, which we're having to do these days.
Right, which gets me thinking about getting into connected systems, and which is why Shuli is just great having you here, because in the combination of things with the cast of characters we have with us today, myself included, OT, right? Most computers are in IT, most conversations are on IT. SBOM, because it connects to critical infrastructure, has all us OT people talking about it, where the resources are small, devices are small, and everything we mentioned. But we need to combine it in a way that meets LFE's goals, so that we have small devices running open source code, quite often connected in real time, taking fast actions at very low cost. And we can track this, I think, right down to the SBOM itself. But it plays more to the question of all those stakeholders. So surely, that, and again, I'm still thinking the same sort of things, take it where you'd like, but the non-security applications of this, the making, let me try to phrase it this way. So the only way I could see to really get the efficiencies we all need out of your success is getting rid of a lot of the steps in between. And SBOMs and the visibility systems that we're talking about are intrinsically those. So if that makes any sense, sorry, it was a long lead up, but
yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing I want to say is that this is not about that LF Energy's goal is decarbonization. This is society's goals. This is National Grid's goals, Schneider Electric's goal, Cybeats' goal. All of our goals have to be this. Then the question really becomes, how do we do this, and what are the parts of that problem? And I wanted to go back to the carbon question, which is, could an SBOM actually include data with regards to emissions, with regards to, like what actually might be the nature of the SBOM moving forward, beyond just license and provenance and attestation. And I think that the answer is absolutely. We are going to have to figure out ways of innovating at every single level of our systems. There's a sister foundation at the Linux Foundation called the Green Software Foundation that's mostly focused on CPU cycles. And so how do we actually reduce the CPU cycles in our software so that it runs faster, is not burning as much energy in order to be able to deliver the same results? I envision a day in which all firmware, all software that is interacting with power system networks actually has the ability to query for price, some kind of price, quantity, time, emissions, based on sort of the conditions of where it's operating, because that will be necessary. Eventually, one day, my refrigerator needs to know that so that it runs in an optimal way that will facilitate the grid operator and will facilitate decarbonization. So, where is SBOMs in that? I think it is the beginning of a cultural change, which is the recognition, that how we used to think about security was with great big walls and huge, cast iron padlocks. And we may need to think about security in a different way that has to do kind of with the attestation of this is what this is and this is what we know it to be. One example is that we had a software project that we brought on from ARPA-E, which is kind of one of the innovation arms of the U.S. government, and that open source software, when we did the SBOM, had multiple high criticality issues with it, with regards to the licensing, and then how it was that operators might use that software, and those are precisely the kinds of things we have to stop. We have to stop creating software that way, whether it's DG Energy for the European Commission, or NRCan in Canada, or DOE in the United States. I mean, globally, this conversation that we're having has to actually replicate out, and that the issue is more about scale and adoption, and a commitment to developing new kinds of hygiene. And then we can decide what data needs to be in there, because ultimately, if you look at USB 3, you have electrons and data flowing over the same line. You don't need a lot of data. They're very small signals, but we could be building software, and that software and that emissions data could actually be included in the SBOM. So I think there's all kinds of innovations, but we're at the beginning, which is, can we build agreement that, at least from a process standpoint, this is the place to start, and that network operators should assume that there will be a software bill of material for any devices that they put on the grid, and so in that way, we're at the beginning of a really exciting time. And I think on some level, COVID has really taught us a lot, as horrible and horrifying as it has been, because we see how easily an infection or a vector can spread. And the same thing is true with software. It can spread very quickly and take down, like the Colonial Pipeline, or SolarWinds, or other big examples in the last 12 months.
Well, you're right. You're right. I now I know why I miss you. We need to have coffee in soon. This is really, really soon, because I think you're right. But then again, I'm an optimist about these sort of things. I think that is a cultural change. I think we see this already in the last 12 and 24 months in the early SBOM concepts. But Phil, let me put the concerns of a lot of people out there to you this way. I've heard that now that we have SBOMs, Cassie has to give you all of her intellectual property, and you're going to, on behalf of the grid operator, every time something goes wrong, hold them accountable in really mean ways, because now that you can see what's going on, it's going to, the intellectual property control. I'd really love to hear this, all around the room, because this is the big roadblock. Everybody's like, oh, this came up at a cyber center recently with just a group of folks like you, top folks. Somebody saying, I'm really not sure we can do this. Aren't we giving everything away? So does it mean, Phil, that everybody has to give you everything?
It doesn't mean that they have to give us everything, but at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily be entirely concerned, because operators of systems like ourselves are not in the business of selling SCADA software or trying to build our own tools. Predominantly the big utilities now, we are asset managers. We are managing significant energy infrastructure assets in order to get the cleanest energy we can from point A to point B. from source to consumer. We are not trying to pivot out into building our own systems. We may have done that 30 years ago out of necessity, and there's a lot of standards and a lot of protocols out there which are very bespoke to individual organizations and utilities. But standardization of things like communications protocols is a great example of how we really want to take products that are off the shelf and benefit from an understanding of each other's requirements to ensure that we get the best value product that is already verified to do what we need it to do. So I think starting from that principle where we're not competitors, we are consumers of the product, it's entirely reasonable to know, what are the ingredients in the product that you are buying. The recipe of how it's put together obviously is also exposed through this process, which I understand the concern, but the concepts of what it is doing are still protected intellectual property. They are still the concepts and the methods that people are using are still their own property, even if you can see the code they're using to derive that. I think one of the biggest obstacles in us keeping embedded devices secure for some time has been this wrapper that's put around lots and lots of other people's intellectual property, lots of other whether it's operating systems, real-time operating systems, protocol stacks, security capabilities that are embedded within things. Ultimately, the value that comes from the manufacturers tends to be their understanding of the problem that's there to be solved, and many of the products that we see now, they're not as integral to if they're a single integral product. It isn't necessarily going to have digital inputs and outputs and custom boards. So often you open it up and you find just a computer inside. So and absolutely, there's still a huge amount of value in the concept that the vendor is selling to us, but it's because it's wrapped up in other people's software and other people's components. It exposes us to a large number of risks. And whereas on a Windows PC, I can take a patch and fix a component. At the moment, if I want to do that on something like a programmable logic controller or a protection relay, I have to update everything, both the functionality and the vulnerabilities. And quite often I was happy with the functionality before. And that's one of our biggest operational constraints to doing deployments of bug fixes, because you can't just fix the vulnerability, you fix everything since the last release. Some of which you don't have that same choice to pick and choose the components that you want to update. So it is absolutely a challenge that when you start to open up and openly demonstrate to the customer what the components are, that the customer will realize that there are lots of other items in there which are potentially entirely outside of the control of the vendor. It shouldn't be seen as an intellectual property risk, because those things are still protected in law. We cannot just take a concept somebody else has developed and take that and build it into our own product. And most of the best protection that any vendor has against the theft of their intellectual property is time to market. By the time somebody may take a concept, even if reverse engineering it and try to turn it into a product, it may take 3, 4, 5 years to turn that into something practical anyway, by which time you hope things have moved on. There's absolutely nothing stopping somebody dismantling an iPhone and copying all of the ways in which that's made. But by the time they've done that and recreated it, the next one will be on the market. So I think in a world where things are evolving very quickly, I think the ways in which intellectual property are protected will not be through obscurity. It's not a great way to protect us from a security perspective either. So why should obscurity be a great way to protect intellectual property? I think intellectual property protection is best done through the mechanisms that have existed for centuries. It's through copywriting, it's through patenting, it's through registering trademarks and registering that intellectual property, and then entering into the right commercial arrangements with the consumers. Obscurity is not the best way to protect things, because it can be reverse engineered, and ultimately, it will not disclosing the information will force an asset owner to try and find a way of getting the information that they haven't had presented to them. And there's an obvious emerging market in that space as well, in ways to get things like SBOMs from products where you can't just get it presented to you from the original developer.
Well, and there's, I've heard you say some of these points, but there's the sort of hippie optimism that I agree with. Shuli mentioned a cultural change, but for many years I've made the point in business that actually being nice, is good, and there's not a trick. What you do is you're transparent, you create a real relationship, and right at the end there you mentioned forming right business relationships, right? That's kind of fundamental, and just a clarifier, I guess, at the end. Do you think Shirley's right? Is there a cultural thing? Or do you think not just yourself, but large utilities are more likely to be better customers, do more business, have shorter sales cycles as your vendors create those relationships that open up, share literally SBOMs and that sort of thing?
No, absolutely. They will create a stronger engagement and foster a better relationship through that continual and open dialogue. Any obstacles or barriers that are put up to these new questions that are being asked will ultimately affect the short-term relationship. But as the understanding of the requirement for SBOMs increases, it will become a complete obstacle to ongoing business. Because with changing legislation and changing attitudes in this space, if a vendor is not willing to produce an SBOM, it may completely prevent them from engaging in future contractual relationships, because it will become also ultimately a mandatory requirement rather than something that is just there to maintain an ongoing and existing relationship that may exist in this space. So these relationships are often very long. They don't change significantly over time, because through the amount of time that we have to manage these assets to extract great value for ratepayers. So we can't just swap and change solutions with a whim. So the relationships we enter into tend to be long term and strategic. And the nature of those relationships will always change over time as we better understand the risks and vulnerabilities that we might be facing. An ever-changing ecosystem. If I was to reflect back on the last 10 years in terms of the decarbonization journey, it used to be a scenario. Now it is the scenario. To go green, to decarbonize. It's not something that we might select. It's something we will. And to see that sort of shift and that sort of change over the last 10 years means that the relation, it's just a great demonstration of how contracts throughout these long strategic relationships may need to evolve, but they ultimately do expire, and it's better to be prepared for it than for that relationship to come to a shuddering halt in the future when these things become mandatory commercial requirements.
Which is a fantastic segue, Cassie. So now Phil's great. We all love Phil. He's a good, respectable customer, and there are a lot of benefits to tightening that relationship to the vendor. But you have competitors, and a lot of folks out there are really down on the whole SBOM thing, because now people, my competitor's going to find out my features and so on and so on and so forth. What are among the strongest either supporting statements or opposing statements you could make from that from a vendor perspective? Is IP control better or worse?
I think the IP discussion is generally more from a fear, because we don't have a lot of processes and a lot of discussions yet formed on what the proper protocols are to provide the materials who would require access. I wanted to just keep giving a thumbs up to what Phil was saying earlier in regards to the visibility and what the relationship does. We absolutely can build and do build products that are encrypted, so you can't reverse engineer everything. But that doesn't mean that that takes away the right for someone to need to know anything in regards to cryptographic libraries or the real-time operating systems. But from an intellectual property standpoint, I think that less focus on, is the competitor going to find out information? It's really, there are, as Phil mentioned, methods. There are, over the years, I mean, people have moved from one company to another, and they would have some of that knowledge. That there's no change now versus then. When you file an IP patent, absolutely everybody's looking at it to be able to do a standpoint of some level of reverse engineering or seeing what features are available. That's not going to change. This is the SBOM is not, it's just not going to give that full visibility. I love how, Phil, you were talking about it from a cooking metaphor. The temperature that I have my my saucepan makes an entire difference, and yet you're not, it depends on your stove. It depends, when we build products, on who's architecting it, how it's all put together, especially at a system model. One single SBOM for a component, the intellectual property discussion that really bears no merit, in my opinion. It's definitely important to be able to provide context with from an SBOM perspective, and that might give some visibility in how things were treated. And we do consider this information internally to be confidential, and it will continue to be that way. There's not a reason to distribute to the entire world, the SBOM for something that is part of critical infrastructure. Now, it could be a consumer product. That's a different story, right? If I want to know the SBOM for my fire alarm that's installed in my house, I should be, that's a consumer product you're, putting out to millions. But the risk of that versus a system component, or especially a system itself, like an entire system going into some critical infrastructure, there's a big difference. And so we want to make sure that relationship and how that information is provided, and provide what Shuli was mentioning about the attestation and provenance. Those are difficult discussions. We're not talking about something that generally just goes in a box and ships to your house, right? There's many, especially in the energy sector, there's partners, there's distributors, there's commissioning processes, there's projects. All of them can impact and affect the SBOM and the entire system bill of materials. And we have to consider it as a whole, let alone, when they're maintaining it within the asset owner inventory, they've made adjustments to configurations. They've changed the nature of it, and they need to have that visibility for interoperability purposes and for other, again, risk reduction and mitigation factors. They need to be aware of it. So my answer simply is no, I don't consider this an important part as an intellectual property issue.
That was awesome. And I think I if you want to answer this, or anybody, as security people, I think we all have the same answer. But I also heard in the same sort of tone of voice that, gosh, now all the hackers are going to know everything and have all this information they never had access before, and will never be able to secure anything. Does this make it any easier for bad guys? I mean, to Cassie, as a vendor, let me ask you that one, because I like to spin another one at Shuli.
Yeah, I mean, what Phil was saying, I mean, reverse engineering happens. When we've got encrypted products, there is a level of, trust that we have in the encryption, of course. And you'll see, I believe, as part of this, more and more throughout just the industry of encryption, secure boot, different kinds of items. But the roadmap to the hackers, again, it's they've had tools. In many cases, they have better tools than our commercial vendors and suppliers can give us to really be able to take things apart. And because they were doing it for nefarious purposes, whereas we were doing it to be able to provide visibility. And I think that that inspection that we're seeing now as becoming part of it, it will expand. Those tools will continue to get better, but the threat actors will continue to get better and find other methods. So again, it's, if someone realizes that there might be a certain real-time operating system on a product, that's affecting millions of products. It's not just a single vendor at that point. And so as an industry, we have to do our due diligence to improve the security posture overall. As Phil mentioned, looking at secure protocols, different kinds of items. It's not just one single SBOM that's going to give that threat. We've seen way too many in the MITRE attack paths and different methods that an SBOM would have had no difference whether it was visible or not.
And I agree entirely. I was just going to say, I agree entirely with that point. I've seen vulnerabilities in products described as day zeros by security researchers out searching for kudos, which are really just vulnerabilities that have been, were affecting, Red Hat kernels from, 6-7 years previous with a different CVE reference. And a lot of that comes about because from an attack surface perspective, it's entirely obvious what the potential vulnerabilities will be from the ports that are open on the device. And, I think or trying to obscure things like the real-time operating system is it only potentially delays very targeted attacks. But a lot of relatively basic reconnaissance would give an attacker a pretty straightforward example of what might be there. And I think, as I said before, I think security by obscurity is incredibly outdated as a technique within ICS and OT security. I think right now, through transparency, we will make sure that we have the right processes in place to remove the obvious vulnerabilities that might be there for attackers to try and exploit, whether it's through patching or through knowledge of those vulnerabilities, putting in place other constraints and other controls. Now, I don't think that always fixing the vulnerability is going to be a practical thing to do, but defending against that vulnerability through various layers of defense, whether it's zero trust networks, software-defined networking, good firewalls, or just decent configuration where you switch off insecure services. 10-year-old devices running a web interface are going to be absolutely riddled with all sorts of very basic vulnerabilities that script kiddies in bedrooms can exploit with, using Kali Linux. Switch off, the access to that port if you're not using that service or it's over vulnerable. That's a very straightforward mitigation. But unless you're exposed to those things, it's incredibly difficult to do so. And this is just one obvious technique to do that.
That's so. Shuli, I was kind of, there's so much to build on there. So take this whatever you like, but in the last bit here of the conversation, I want to look at systemic values. What are the values we're going to get out of this now? We have a question, Anthony, queued up, something along the lines of how are SBOMs helpful in reality to people in the current scenario of society, and then end with looking out forward. We're all looking right here at dealing with this thing right now, but each of us are working with organizations and trends that have longer terms. So Shuli, if you want to start with that or riff off what our friends have been saying, the current reality of what are the benefits we're getting in the long term.
This is a great conversation, and I think that there may be nuances that we agree or disagree on that I think would be really interesting to explore. But Black Duck and Synopsys had done studies multiple years in a row in which 100% of power system software has open source in it. And of that, the typical stack is 80 to 90% open source. So for all purposes, what's different between what used to be and what is now is that modern software is, because of the microservices architecture, cloud native, regardless of whether the cloud is on-prem or is public or private, off, whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's that model of computing is driving the speed of change. And so the thing that we're not talking about as much, which I think is, that I use a lot to talk about, well, what does it mean to be having these conversations now? SBOMs are one arrow in our quiver. It is not the whole thing. There are many different things that we're going to have to attend to going forward, including the possibility that these 50-year life cycles are obsolete. Because we're going to be building infrastructure in a fundamentally different way. When telecommunications transformed, they were 75% hardware, and they went to 25% hardware and 75% software defined. Now, electrons need a physical surface to travel on. And so because of that, there's always going to be issues with regards to ways of hijacking metadata about electrons or about demand or any of those things that could be interjected onto a network. But we are building something that is much closer to the internet than to what it is that we had 50 years ago. And in terms of being able to balance supply and demand and congestion and markets and all of those things. Why I think SBOMs are really important is that the speed of the urgency of what we have to do in the next 8 years is unbelievable. If we have to move to decreasing carbonization of power networks by 55% in the next 8 years, I mean, that's what Europe is saying. I think that's what Biden would like, 50%, that directionally we're talking about a quality of transformation that just doesn't exist. And at the heart of it, really, the parts, that are going to be composed of that software are going to be all kinds of new digital tools, and people are going to be innovating, and we don't know what it's going to end up looking like. All we can see are kind of the early edges of that. So when I think about the problem that faces us, because carbon and fossil fuel enabled, as an innovation kind of scholar, and what I think about are diffusion curves or linear curves. And the linear curve for fossil fuel and carbon march at exactly the same rate. Well, guess what? Our GDP also marches at exactly that same rate. And so what you have is from the mid-1800s to now, we are at a stratospheric height, and we're beginning to see the very early stages of turbulence in the system. And so the question then becomes, can we move fast enough so that nation state actors, geopolitics, consumers becoming completely freaked out that they're having to choose between food and heating and work or supply chain seizing? I mean, we're getting a preview just in the last couple of weeks of sort of the territory that we're moving in. And I'm in the rip the Band-Aid off and start building it together, and really agreeing to the IP issues so that the IP is leveraged and that we can share and that we can scale as quickly as possible. And that is a really different kind of stage of innovation that we're at. We're not homeostasis and inertia are not the things that are going to help us to get to where we need to get to. We're going to have to begin innovating at speed. And so, yes, it's critical infrastructure, but we go too fast, we break shit, or we go too slow and our societies break apart. And so that's kind of, the trade-off. At the beginning of time, there was a thing where people would carry stuff and they would put all their burdens in their arms and they carried them. Then somebody invented the wheel. okay? And the wheel was an extraordinary innovation. It put all the people that carried stuff almost out of business. But then what they did was they built roads. And once they started building roads, they opened the world for commerce, and that was the Silk Road. Well, what we're doing is we are building a new road, and that old road, we need to keep them both going at the same time so we don't crash. We have a mandate globally to transform our economies at a speed of change that humans are not actually really accustomed to, except in the open source world. And in that realm, that is where I planted my flag, is that open source is the only way that we can actually do this.
Wow, that was awesome. And you put so many parts to it, right? You know, with the timeline, right? We're on, I've said many times, but I'll say it again. We are on an inevitability curve right now regarding supply chain transparency. And now we know, as of May of this year, that yes, you're doing SBOMs, as you all have said, and we're going in this path. And Phil, I think you had mentioned, and this has come up again in these same conversations we've all been part of over the last 2 years, that just as we're thinking it through, it's like, well, could you imagine being a supplier and not having an SBOM in 10 years and trying to sell to a grid operator? It's like, that's not a thing. So we're on this curve. In that time, we will be there. But, Shirley's exactly right. We have a lot of other drivers. We have a climate to deal with. And, this is, again, no longer a big political topic. Big, serious grid operators, nation states and everybody else are going down this path, period. We have this much time. And, with SBOMs and supply chain security, we're not going to solve all those pieces, I guess. But Cassie, and unless Bill, you want to jump in, this is that long-term thing again. Do we have time? Are we on the right path to at least couple this visibility effort with what we all need for each of these other steps we're talking about?
Well, it depends on your definition of time. I think that we're going to have to take it in really steps and break it down. Generally, contracts may say provide an SBOM, but that definition is really between the supplier and the customer to say, what can I give you now? This is what I can provide, and expand on it as the future grows. I mean, Phil mentioned about the patch cycle. Well, it could be that with evolutions, maybe only the 2-3 previous versions of SBOMs are available. I mean, you could have had hundreds of releases for products, and it takes time, especially with thousands of products in a portfolio and thousands of releases for those products. How are you going to really give that full visibility? So I do think that there's steps to take at a smaller scope level, and that's how we're just having to address it. And it is that journey that Shuli was talking about. I do, I am looking 5 years down the road. Where can we get to be able to scale this? It's not scalable in its current form. We all realize that, and having those discussions and saying this is where I am right now. We're putting this on the roadmap so that we can go further. And I only have this information. This is just that what I can achieve, and other people will be even much farther behind that, right? For some, they're just not going to be able to take that forward. So it's going to be a journey, a discussion. There's not going to be a right way in the beginning because this is all brand new, and then there's going to be a lot of fear, honestly, and concern in this whole process because people are. That accountability factor of, how do I answer if they come back to me with a question on this? There's a lot of resource time of learning your past things. I mean, especially in our world, software and firmware can live for decades. And how do you go back and ask those questions? I mean, Shuli, you're talking about attestation, but something that was coded in 1994 or earlier, you're not going to have that information. So it generates fear and uncertainty and doubt. And that's why we have to just have that proper relationship between each other and as we go through this.
And I would just add to that. Sorry, Chris. I was just going to say, I'd just add to that and just reflect back again on what Shuli was saying. There is only one mission now, which is ultimately our mission of decarbonization. So I think if we are going to achieve our aims of, in that respect, grid modernization is absolutely key to that. And if we're going to get there with the technologies in the distribution space, the distributed energy reserves, using new low carbon forms of both energy generation, but storage and energy saving mechanisms and trading mechanisms, we are going to need to make sure that can happen without hindrance. And it's important we don't see these things as conflicting priorities, but enablers. It's cybersecurity as a whole. Software bill of materials, these are not things that are there to add yet another barrier or another constraint to grid modernization, but they should be seen as tools which will increase our capability and our productivity in those areas. If we don't inherently improve the security of the products that we're putting out there on the edge, which are going to enable this decarbonization journey, then that whole process will be slowed down because of people's naturally risk-averse tendencies. People will then worry about how do they mitigate those things, and it will constantly add to the burden, which will ultimately slow down the adoption of those capabilities. Things like software bill of materials, both in terms of giving certainty in contract language, being certain of the products you're receiving, being certain of the quality and the capability, will allow them to be deployed faster and will allow us to get things out there in a much more consistent and repeatable manner, which ultimately means lower costs to the consumer and a faster deployment. And those are the things that we need to be focusing on, is not how does this make our jobs more difficult, but actually how does this make our jobs easier and therefore more efficient.
Beautiful.
For the record, I love you folks.
I love
that's exactly
right. I love those.
Well, in certainty, I know we have a question out there for you, Shuli, and so I'll get that out here. It is but I just say certainty, is such a key to all this. So, so many projects at SBOMs. How can you keep and organize all the information? So all this stuff. You want to get right at that, or we're in the last 4 minutes, so take this where you would like.
LF Energy sits inside an ecosystem, and one of the sister foundations is SPDX. And so, we do quarterly SBOMs, and those SBOMs scans actually include all the information, kind of dribbles all the way down, like what actually is in this all the way down, so that we know that when Enel or Schneider or National Grid go out and start building, the next version of, for instance, substations, that they're using a virtualization and protection software that is going to stead them for the transition. And so, this is not my area of expertise. This is just sort of like, I think it's table stakes. We have to recognize this is how we're going. What I loved about our conversations, Chris, probably like a year and a half ago, is you would talk about the inventory of everything. And I found that kind of overwhelming to think about. But then we have some asset management software that's coming in from one of the world's largest energy producers on the planet that's all about asset management. And that I think that a case can be made that we will be managing these sorts of digital inventories from now until forever. And at the heart of it, we will be able to start using that data in new ways that we never even imagined, that are not about the SBOM per se, but about the composition of our network. And once we actually begin to get at that, it's like that is the value add for the national grids of the world. The ability to provide visibility to the far reaches of the network, and to ensure and manage for anomalies and all kinds of ways of looking at security. But it sort of starts with this foundational thing, kind of leading to an inventory of everything, leading to this next thing. And so when we have a system that's as complex as it is, I think our best friend is process. Is, can we create transparency? Can we create integrity of relationships, and then grow that over time? And with that, trust, so that we actually trust each other, that, you're not trying to shut this down, but you have just as much of a desire and good and will to improve the system, so that when we get through to the other end of this, we are the superheroes. There's no plan B. It's us. And so I love that part. So that's kind of the way I would look at it. I don't, it's the inventory of everything, and we're going to need it.
Right. We're gonna need it. And with that, we're at time. I couldn't thank each of you more. Phil Tonkin and National Grid, Cassie, Crossley, Schneider Electric, and the inimitable Shuli. Shirley Goodman with
whatever your
Hawaii
name
Foundation
is.
Energy Project. Hawaii Foundation Energy Project. I am lucky to get through the day and remember my own name at this point. I am apparently Chris Blask. And thank you all for being here on the panel and out in the world and making the world a better place to be.
Thanks, Chris. Be safe. Stay afloat.
I'll do my best. Thank you.
Welcome to the State of Cybersecurity Industry panel series. We are proud to bring together decades of cybersecurity experience from world-class experts, executives, and strategic advisors. We will explore the present and future of cybersecurity evolution, talk about compliance and regulation, best practices, emerging threats, and the impact on the IoT and OT device market.